Thank you so much for that introduction. We're all really glad to be here. It looks like a great crowd. We're going to have a conversation trying to make sense of what has happened in the past year and what should continue to happen. And then after our conversation, after about 20 minutes of conversation, we're going to open it up to audience questions. So we'd like this to be conversational and to be kind of a town hall. And we look forward to hearing from you all as well. So Sukhinder, I wanted to start with you. You spoke at the Atlantic's first annual Inclusion in Tech Summit last year. And during that event, we asked the following question. If we come back out here next year and have this same conversation, what, if anything, will have changed in the year? So obviously, a lot has changed in the past year in ways that we wouldn't have anticipated, but especially when it comes to allegations and reports of sexism in Silicon Valley. What are your thoughts? I'm sure that you've been thinking about this past year. What are your thoughts about this past year, and what has it been like for you experiencing it from the inside?
I thought you were going to repeat what I said last year, which I can't remember. So God bless that you didn't do that, because then I would really feel embarrassed. So a couple things. So first of all, and I'm sure that everybody on this panel can speak to it, and everybody in the audience, I think there is no doubt it's been a watershed year. Right? And it's been a watershed year for reasons that we're not all proud of, right? But mostly it's been a watershed year because what was different this year than every other year of our conversation on diversity and inclusion in tech is that when people spoke up, there were repercussions. And there was the loss of power and the loss of reputation. And it's very different than every other time people have spoke up, not just in tech, but in a lot of different sectors. And so in tech itself, there were repercussions for bad actors. For the first time, people in power lost power. And then that was amplified across media. God willing, across politics, it will also be so. We'll see how today goes in Alabama. But the point overall being that there was an amplification of that by other sectors and a reinforcement of loss of power. And so I think it's a watershed moment for that year alone. This is probably the defining moment for us where you can say, and not for good reason, by the way. The board list is doing really well. Not for good reason, right? It is because it is the antithesis of the problem statement and hopefully part of the solution. But we will certainly look back on this year and say, we all remember when, an amazing set of women spoke up and people reacted, and there was, for the first time, repercussion to bad actors.
And Erica, would you like to add to that? I'm sure.
Yeah, I'm going to echo what Sukhinder said. It was about power this year. We did see a lot of people losing power, and that's what this whole conversation is about. It is about power. It is about people trying to claim power, retain power, and use their power. And this year we saw those people who have been holding on to their power lose their power, and it's why it's been a watershed year. And another interesting thing that happened this year was that people were finally listened to. It was interesting to see Time do the Person of the Year story where they said the people who spoke up, the silence breakers were the Person of the Year. And it's like, well, calling them silence breakers implies that there was a silence to be broken, as though people weren't already speaking up. And what was different this year is that people were listened to, right? Like, the people who spoke up, the Susans and the people in Hollywood and everywhere else were listened to and believed. That is a major change to what we've seen previously. The moment someone spoke up, I don't know if you remember what happened with Julie Horvath, but she spoke up about what happened at GitHub, and she wasn't believed or listened to, right? And had she spoken up this year, I think what happened to her would be completely different.
And Megan, what has it been like reporting this year? What has it felt like as a reporter? And do you think that the media attention to these issues has actually changed behavior at companies?
The first word that came to mind was exhausting. It's
yeah. That's
one
true in
thing
Washington
after another.
Also, yeah.
Hashtag Uber, but it's just. Oh, anyway, I don't want to get too off. Too off
no, that's
topic,
right.
But
that's right.
Yeah, it's in terms of how media coverage has. I mean, well, I don't know. When I think about it, I wonder. As Erica said, I mean, the difference is that it's not that women and people who have been harassed were silent before, but it's just that people weren't listening. So I'm more interested in, like, what made people suddenly start caring? Part of me is like, well, maybe like the most silver sliver of lining from Trump's presidency is that people are like they're more aware of just like how messed up this country is. And now they're finally seeing that they play a role in this and that they can have an impact in making change. So, I mean, yeah, I think it's definitely helpful that the media is like calling these things out. But I mean, Susan Fowler, she just like wrote on Medium, just like, this is what's happening. So I mean, it's not just the media, it's really the people who are speaking up and being willing to be vulnerable and share their stories.
And did either of you have thoughts on why it is that these allegations are sticking, that people are being believed in a way that they haven't before? Did you have additional
So
thoughts?
I think there are a couple different things. So I think in the case of Uber and Susan Fowler, I think we can't not recognize that the board was having challenge on other business issues related to kind of the reign of the previous CEO. And so I think Susan was a tip of the iceberg in the case of Uber, and I think because it was that issue combined with other issues that were being brought to the attention of the board, and then I think those things together actually created change. This is not to not give credit to Susan. I give a ton of credit to her, but I think part of the reason it got listened to is because it was symptomatic of bigger behavior that was affecting the business.
Right.
And so I think that's why the board had to listen ultimately, right, and react and respond. But I think that Susan's key change was, using her voice, and despite the NDA, and despite having going to Medium and directly telling her story and facing risk in doing that. But I think it was the combination at Uber of business issues and surfacing as a result of the actions of the CEO and the culture at Uber. And then this shows up as this sort of, in some ways, massive reflection of what else might be going on, and in fact is going on, right, with regard to the kind of the way that company operates. And so I think that's one of the key differences. I mean, I suspect, and I hate to say this, but I suspect if we had been looking back on a year where a company was doing gloriously well, and this one issue showed up, I wonder. I really do wonder. So I think that it was symptomatic of bigger issues and thus taken more seriously. And then I think that set off a chain reaction where other people also felt after Susan could speak up that they could speak up. And then I think there was strength in numbers, and then I think there was a whole snowball effect that we needed. But it does make you wonder, right? It's the pursuit of growth above all else historically, right, in kind of a venture capital fueled environment. And a lot of things were breaking at the same time at Uber, and this became a seminal kind of, I think, symbol of that.
Well, what about within Project Include, a group that is formed, to promote inclusion? Was were you all poised and ready for this moment? Was it exhausting for you? Was there a strategy in place? Or were you figuring out a strategy on the fly? To what extent do you feel like you all helped continue the chain reaction? What did it feel like from the inside?
From the inside of Project Include, it was kind of a moment of relief, actually. We weren't ready for this, to be quite honest. It was something we'd hoped for, but we never believed that, one person's voice would take down an entire company, right? Susan was the reason Travis had to resign. We were not ready for that, but it was like a moment of finally, right? A person was listened to, a woman was believed about what she experienced within her company, right? Susan is not the first, again, and she is not the first to speak up, and she's not the first to experience all those things. And to have her, A, not sign the NDA, B, tell her story, and C, be believed, was a complete change. And so when that happened, it was just oh my goodness, we might have a chance here, right? It was just a very important, powerful moment. And then we began, doing our work internally. We do a lot of writing and amplifying of voices, and we were okay, we need to move on this because this is super important.
Well, was there strategizing? Was there targeting of other bad actors? Because we see other bad actors starting to be identified, or was it just happening, virally, kind of?
I think it was happening virally. Within the Project Include group, we know stories that came out. We knew them before they came out, and we still know some stories that have not yet come out. But it is not ours to tell those stories, right? Those stories belong to the people who experience them, and it is not for us to share the stories for those women unless they ask us to.
Right. Well, I just remember when I was doing my reporting, I was talking to some members of Project Include who were talking about their own experiences, you know, with certain venture capitalists, and then I sort of figured out who they were probably talking about. So it sounded as though there were women within Project Include who had you know, their own experiences with some of these people.
Absolutely, they did, and they had spoken up before and been silenced. But now that you know other women are speaking up about those specific venture capitalists, their stories are coming to the forefront again.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So we've heard a little bit in the, I don't want to minimize the overall positive consequences of this. You said that Boardlist has had a very good year, but we do hear some talk about backlash. Certainly there was conversation this summer, and let's just refer to him as he who shall not be named, right? Who floats the idea that maybe the reason, specifically with regard to gender, that there aren't, you know, as many women in tech nearly as there should be, that it's because of some biological deficiency, I guess. How widespread is that view? How much of a backlash are we actually seeing and hearing, or has that been overplayed? Megan, you want to take that?
You mean how much of a backlash, like in the mainstream, or what do you mean?
Well, okay. So how widespread is the view that the numbers are actually representative of sort of reality? Whose small numbers of, say, of women in tech are actually representative of the fact that there are, well, not the fact. How widespread is the view that there aren't enough women in tech because women, you know, aren't as good at this? Like, is that just a little tiny little fringe view, or is that something that you hear?
I mean, I think that there are people who are incredibly misguided who think that.
Right.
I mean, yeah. I mean, there are always doubters. There are always people who are ignorant. And I mean, but I think in terms of, is that something that I hear often? I mean, of course, like something that we hear is like the pipeline problem, which is like not real. But yeah, people like to say that it's because there aren't enough talented people of color, like women, et cetera, in order to like get these jobs. But really, I mean, it's systemic. It's just that our society was, you know, built on racism and sexism, and it's still here.
And also in terms of backlash, have you seen any evidence of what the sort of the Pence rule? Well, we'll just avoid women if this is going to be a problem, and just, you know, not have pitch sessions.
Yeah, I've heard people say things like that. I'm specifically thinking of a colleague of mine who. She is just very well sourced in the VC world, and she's referenced sometimes when male VCs have been like, well, I mean, I guess we just won't invest in female founders then. We'll just like, you know, do that. And I mean, that's obviously not the solution.
Right, obviously, yeah. Right.
Yeah, I think there are a couple things. So I think we talked about, so I think the sort of, the women are biologically not sufficient kind of, right, I think that's a very few. I think what is more widespread, or what I perceive, is fear, right? And actually fear not just among bad actors. And I think we just do need to recognize that all of this happened for a very good reason. You know, there's a pendulum swing that's happening, right? So there is fear, right, on the other side of that.
Fear of the loss of power, the loss of money?
I would just say I think there's fear across the board. I mean, and I say this in the best possible way. I think there are good actors who worry that they have unconscious bias or discriminated in the past and don't even know if they did. I think that there are people who are like, oh my gosh. I mean, I don't know if you all, I've heard those stories where people are like, oh my goodness. Like people self-reflecting in a good way. Gee, I wonder if back in college she really did say yes. I mean, we do hear, you know, so I hear good men and good people reflect and say like, oh gosh, did I do something without realizing it? And some of those people, in the best possible way, go back and ask, or go back and reflect, or go back and check with women they've worked with. So I think there's that side of fear, which is actually very productive fear, I would say, right all the way to the unproductive fear, which is I just won't work with women because, you know, gosh, you know, that's risk to me. And I think the place that's most likely to happen, as we've identified, is in corridors where you have almost complete power, right? You are the sole founder or quasi-founder, like, which VCs often are. They're in a limited partnership where they're all quasi-founders in their own power structure, without outside accountability. So unless outside accountability in the form of limiteds and other things starts to impose, or boards in the case of founders, starts to, impose repercussions, yes, that could continue, right? Fear that drives you to the opposite direction. So I think there's productive fear, and the pendulum needs to swing back where people understand what are solutions, what can they do, right? And then I think there's very unproductive fear, which can lead to women being ignored, pushed out, not included, and people will put all sorts of things on it to say, the pencil rule, whatever. And there we have to look to boards and limited partners and structures that are quasi-run, but what I would call kind of kingmakers, right? That's where you see the abuse of power, and that's where you kind of need a check to the power. And the question is, who's going to provide that check if they use these excuses after the year we've had?
Who is going to provide that check?
Well, certainly one thing we do at the board list is this was a seminal year in which we looked at what boards need to do on topics like sexual harassment.
Right.
We also had to turn our attention to that topic, even though we would much rather be talking about, governance and independence. We ourselves had to look at, what boards were doing with regard to sexual harassment. And I think the reality is that there's now a level of accountability with both boards and limited partners on, forget the data that you're not seeing. What's the data you're going to go out and get? Because boards get their information through the lens of the CEO. Limited partners get their information through the lens of the VC, through the lens of the GP. So how are you going to get all the information? That's the question I think boards and limiteds need to be asking themselves. How do you get a 360 view of that partnership and the partners who are your key men? How do you get a 360 view of the organization, including the CEO?
Well, if the company or organization is printing money, Uber, what would motivate the board to do that? Look, would they want those answers, or do they want to not touch it? Don't touch it. It's perfect. Just don't even breathe, right?
Yes.
Will they ask those questions? Are they motivated to ask those questions? I don't think they are, because we are in a capitalist society, and money rules all. Money and power. And if a company is doing well, there is no desire for anyone to bother with them.
By the way, I think
Travis got away with so much at Uber. What happened with Susan wasn't the first thing that came out about his bad acting, right? By far, right? But Uber was doing really well, and he got away with a lot of it because they were making money and they had a lot of power.
So, Erica, I agree with you. I think the challenge in all these situations is we all hope that change comes when it's not needed and when things are going well. Right. History would show us that disruption almost never happens that way. Right. And so, sadly, I also wish that we didn't have a year like we had in order for boards to think about issues like sexual harassment. I worried that they would think about the positive side of culture, right? And doing, 360s of the CEO when the CEO was a great actor long before these issues showed up. But I think I would come back to it. I hate to use this word because I'm an eternal optimist, but the reality is that fear is motivating change. And the fear of and now I would just say maybe for boards and for limiteds, pretty healthy dose of paranoia, which is, you think it's all up and to the right, my friends? You just don't know. So like I said, again, I'm somebody who's, my entire career has been about being an optimist, but I would just say that I think there's a level of paranoia right now inside of limited partnerships and also on boards that may be healthy paranoia.
Yeah. Megan, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, no, as there should be. They should be paranoid because we will find them. And we will publish their names. So yeah, like you were saying, it's unfortunate that it had to come to this. It'd be great if people just didn't want to sexually harass people. And not because they were worried that they'd be found out and lose their job and ruin their reputation, but because it's not something you're supposed to do. It's not a good thing to do. But yeah, here we are.
Think about something that Marco Rogers once said on Twitter. He said that men are taught from an early age that anything good you do you should be rewarded with access to women's bodies, right? And I think that's what we see played out in the sexual harassment space, right? It's that men think that because they're in power and they are doing well, they can behave however they want towards women. And I don't want to limit sexual harassment to say it's just men towards women, because it is everybody towards everybody. But what we are seeing a lot right now is, the harassment of women by men. And again, it all goes back to power. What is your reward for power? Is it access to women's body? No. Then how do we teach men that at an early stage? How do we teach young boys that? How do we stop sexual harassment before it becomes sexual harassment, before someone even gets to the workplace and thinks, I could totally grab her butt and it'd be okay, right? Like, we need to start that at an early age for everybody, not just boys, not just girls, not anybody of any gender. We need to teach that to everybody, that consent is important, that it is required in all places.
Well, that's great. I'd like to open it up to questions now. Please try to keep your question short and have it actually be a question. And feel free to specifically ask the panelists you'd like to respond, or if you just want to ask as a general question, then we'll figure out who wants to answer it. Oh, and we have mic runners who are going to approach and call on audience members.
Hi, my name is Maura Lafferty. I work at Firebrand Communications. And my question goes back to the beginning of the panel. You guys talked about the watershed nature of this year. To what extent do you think Ellen Pau's very public case 2 years ago and the community response to the way that case played out played a role in what we're seeing this year?
Who would like to field that?
I feel like I shouldn't field that because I'm biased, very biased. Ellen is my co-founder and also my very good friend. But I feel like Ellen was one of the people who paved the way, right? Like, we are at this watershed year because Ellen spoke up, because Julie spoke up, because Amelie spoke up, because the women who came before Susan took that risk and spoke up, and they weren't, fully believed, and they experienced challenges you wouldn't believe, harassment you wouldn't believe. Their lives were changed negatively, especially Ellen, because she told her truth, and Kleiner Perkins is like, we're going to bury you in litigation. And that is what they did. And they smeared her name through the media. They used journalists. I don't know if any of them are here, but they definitely used journalists to smear her name, right? And she lost both in the court of public opinion and in actual court, right? And even though she was telling her truth, even though she was harassed at her company. And she paved the way. She made it a little bit easier for each one of us to tell our stories. And I think that she should be congratulated for that and applauded for that. And she should maybe one day be Times Person of the Year. I don't know. Again, biased.
Agree.
Hi, my name is Karen Fleshman. I'm the founder of Racy Conversations. And my question is about the role of white women as the maintainers of the status quo in tech companies and in professional careers in general.
What was the question?
I'm sorry, what's your question?
The question is, I think that a lot of white women identify with the white men in power and maintain the status quo to the detriment of people of color in the workplace. So how can we get white women to change, to become agents of change and align with the other brave women standing up to demand change?
So how can we get white women to change? Okay.
So respectfully, I'm going to disagree. I think we're in a year and a time where we realize it's not, and this is to the point of Project Include and the team here, it's not about white women versus women of color. It's not about women of color versus men of color. It's not about men of color versus transgender. To me, I think so I guess I don't look at a certain class of people and say, like, gosh, I think that they are maintaining the status quo. I think that women overall, as a class, would say they have had different experiences depending on whether they are women of color or kind of women of a certain ethnicity or whether you're transgender. So for me, I don't know that I believe that there's this conscious, we don't identify with people of color and we're trying to maintain the status quo. I think you could talk to that population, and they may not understand what's going on with other populations because there's not that experience. But I don't think we can cast that because they don't understand it, they don't empathize with it or want to empathize with it. But I think it comes back to understanding. I mean, I don't pretend to understand what Erica's experience is, and Erica probably doesn't understand what my experience is. But my job and my worldview is to be respectful of what her experiences are and to create a place of inclusion overall. So I guess my POV is slightly different, which is I think I don't see a class of women who are going through the world presuming it's all great. But I think just they have a set of experiences, and we can't paint the world as, you know, the world of only white women's experiences or women of color's experiences or transgender experiences. It should be creating a place that's inclusive of all of our experiences. And I think each of those populations just has a different point of view and hopefully empathy for the broader population that's not them.
I think one of the challenges women of color experience is that we have historically throughout history seen that when we need them, white women often don't show up, right? All the way back to the suffrage movement, you know? And I would hope that in this moment, we begin to see more white women show up, you know? It's a risk. It honestly is a risk for a white woman to go home to her white husband and say, I stood up against you for this group of people, right? It is a risk. And I have seen this year and in the last couple of years a lot of brave white women who have done that, and I appreciate them, and I want to see that continue.
Katja Kronko with the 410. I think my question is kind of around change. So we look at from Hollywood to tech, you know, people like Harvey Weinstein going into sex rehab, you know, Travis is gone. What should he and other people be doing right now so that they, I don't know, I'm not a big person of like punish death, no more. We want these people to be better and come back. They're smart, they're brilliant, they have ideas. So what do some of these men who are all twisted when it comes to their interaction with women need to be doing so that they can come back into the fold and do it right?
Harvey Weinstein has enough money to sit down somewhere and not come back, and I don't want him. He can go off on some beach somewhere for the rest of his life and knit, do something. He does not need to come back. I don't want Harvey Weinstein back. Put a woman in his place. Give a woman his job. I am sure that there are very talented women in Hollywood right now who are just itching to take his place, who will do his job better than he did. Give her that job. I don't want him back. I don't need to see Travis back. Put Bose in his place. Ms. St. John, put her in his place, right? I don't need Travis. I don't need them back. We don't need them. There are plenty of talented women out there. There are plenty of talented people of color. There are plenty of talented everybody else who can take the place of these bad actors. We don't need them in our industry. We don't need them in our society. They can go off, the rich ones can go off and play somewhere else. They're done. They've had their time. They can go.
Okay.
My question is kind of a follow-up to that because my paranoia, sorry, my name's Monica Miller. I'm with Bare Bones PR. And my question is that my own paranoia is that we're not seeing the last of these bad actors and that the loss of power is temporary. And I am super worried about what happens when these people are not actually put in jail, whose money is not taken away from them, but we see them show up in 18 months, in 2 years, in different roles and doing different things. And I see populations both saying, oh, look, it's all happening, and it's inevitable that we're going to move through this into the bright new future. And on the other side, I hear other populations saying, oh, our moment of unruly women is over. And I'm like, what? Okay, it's not inevitable. And is it just me? But are we really gonna like keep the magnifying glass on the folks? And I wanna hear your perspectives about, is this loss of power real? Is it actually going to last? Are these repercussions enough? So please.
Megan, why don't you take that?
Yeah, short answer is no.
Wait, to answer to which?
To, are these losses of power like permanent? I don't believe they are. I mean, there are a couple of examples that come to mind. Like Keith Raboy, for example, a couple of years ago, or maybe like 2 or 3 years ago, there was that whole thing at Square. There weren't really that many repercussions for him. He's back, making a lot of money, living his life. Let's see, in the past week, Andy Rubin, formerly of Google, there was a report against some improper behavior while he was at Google, so he took a leave of absence from Essential, his smartphone company. He returned within a month. So, I mean...
Can you please do a story on those?
Sure. All of the sexual harassers who have come back. Yeah, there's my headline. Yeah.
So do you all think we're going to return to the status quo, that this is just a blip?
I think the men in power would love that, and I think they're pushing for that because they don't want anyone to have a permanent loss of power, because that then signals that they too could permanently lose their power. And so they are pushing for it to be, oh, he's fine, he's okay. He just had, he just needed to go to rehab, or he just needed to do, take a break. He needed to go on his apology tour, Justin called back, right? But they really are married to the idea that their actions don't have permanent consequences, and I think I will continue to push to make sure that their consequences are permanent, and so will Megan. I can't speak for Sukhinder, maybe, but I think Sukhinder's job is going to be to make sure that those men are replaced by women on boards.
Sukhinder, do you have a final thought on that or comment?
Yeah, a couple things. So I think that the way to ensure, and you're right, my role is different because I kind of have a different vehicle that I'm trying to use to affect change. But I think as far as I see it, I think there's no doubt that the thing that will keep the pressure on is continued media, for sure, right? Continued application of bad actors, for sure. And I would just say, if we want it to be systematic change, we have to change some of the systems, right? So I guess I'm more focused on that. Like, I'm focused on changing the systems that create accountability, and to me, boards is one of them. It's sort of like, so to your point, like, yeah, if you're a bad actor, the question is, who are the good actors, and how do they make their way to the fore? So for me, it's very draining to talk only about keeping the bad actors out. Like, what I fundamentally want to do is figure out what are the structures that reinforce good actors, right? And what are the structures that allow good actors to come to the fore and take their place in this moment? And so I think boards and limited partners have to both use productive paranoia to identify the bad actors, and we need to help keep the pressure on so they feel that productive paranoia. But then their job is to create power structures that embrace diversity, power structures that embrace good actors, power structures that embrace the kind of change we want to see. And so I think I look structurally at what we should be doing to keep the pressure on, and what can we create systematically so that as this pressure continues to stay on, that's one piece of it, needs to be replaced, right, with something far more positive and enduring. And I think that's the opportunity.
That's great. Please join me in thanking our great panelists. Thank you.